My stepsister strutted into my divorce settlement, wearing my 2-carat diamond wedding ring. She sank into the plush leather chair right beside my husband, smoothed her skin-tight maternity dress over a perfectly round belly, and smiled a sickeningly sweet smile. "Do not worry, Kendra," she cooed, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I will take much better care of your husband than you ever did." Then, with an arrogant smirk, she reached into her purse, pulled out a crisp $1 bill, and slid it across the heavy mahogany table right to my fingertips. "Buy yourself a bus ticket out of town," she whispered. No one stopped her. My own stepmother sat in the corner nodding in absolute approval. But I did not cry. I did not scream. I just looked at my lawyer Elias and gave him a single deliberate nod. He opened one thin manila folder. Within 10 seconds, my husband's face went the color of dead ash. Before I tell you exactly how I burned their entire lives to the ground, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to take the trash out of your own family. You will not want to miss this. I am Kendra, 35 years old, and a senior financial auditor by trade. My entire career is built on seeing the truth hiding behind the numbers, finding the discrepancies that people try to bury, and unearthing the lies they think they have cleverly disguised. I sit in a room and I read people. I analyze patterns. I calculate risks. That analytical mind has served me exceptionally well in boardrooms across Atlanta, but I never in my wildest nightmares expected I would have to use those skills to audit my own family. Yet there I was sitting on the 35th floor of a downtown Atlanta law firm, staring at the wreckage of my marriage. The suffocating tension in my lawyer Elias's office was heavy enough to crush bone. The air conditioner hummed a low, steady drone against the backdrop of absolute betrayal. The room smelled of cold espresso and expensive polished leather, a sterile environment for the slaughter of an 11-year relationship. The heavy oak door to the conference room swung open, breaking the silence. Jasmine, my 30-year-old stepsister, walked in first. She did not walk so much as she paraded. She wore a skin-tight burgundy maternity dress, clearly chosen to accentuate her pregnant belly, maximizing the visual impact of her supposed triumph. But it was not the dress that caught my attention first. It was her left hand. Flashing under the bright fluorescent lights of the conference room was my wedding ring, a brilliant 2-carat princess-cut diamond that Terrence had slipped onto my finger 5 years ago. She wore it like a trophy, a glittering declaration that she had successfully stolen my life. She pulled out the leather chair beside mine with an exaggerated sigh, rubbing her lower back, performing the role of the exhausted, glowing mother to be for everyone to see. Right behind her came Terrence. 36 years old, the man I had pledged my life to, the man who had promised to protect and honor me. He walked into the room looking like a coward dragging his feet to the gallows. He refused to make eye contact with me. He kept his gaze firmly fixed on the polished mahogany table, adjusting his suit jacket, pulling at his collar, playing the role of the tortured man forced by duty to follow his heart. He sat down heavily next to Jasmine, leaning away from me as if my very presence was somehow an inconvenience to his new happy reality. He wanted to project the image of a man torn by circumstance, a good guy caught in a bad situation. But I knew better. I saw him exactly for what he was. Finally, Vivian entered. 58 years old, dressed in her immaculate Sunday best church suit, a matching emerald green skirt, and blazer tailored to perfection. Vivian was my stepmother, the woman who had helped raise me since my father passed away when I was 12. She walked to the corner of the room, crossing her arms, and sitting straight-backed in a high wing chair. She positioned herself physically and symbolically as Jasmine's bodyguard, acting as the self-righteous matriarch overseeing the transition of power. She looked at me with a cold, detached superiority. There was no love in her eyes, no memory of the decades we had spent under the same roof. There was only greed and a sick sense of victory. I sat across from them, keeping my face completely blank. My posture was straight, my hands folded neatly on the table. Inside my chest, a furnace was burning, incinerating the last remaining shreds of the woman who used to love these people. But on the outside, I was a vault. I described my internal state to myself, not as a broken, barren wife mourning the end of her family, but as a financial auditor observing a poorly executed scam. I let them bask in their arrogance. I let them build their false confidence. They looked at my silence and mistook it for defeat. They thought I was crushed, too devastated by the sight of my husband and my pregnant stepsister to fight back. They had no idea what I held in my arsenal. They had no idea that I had already done the math. The silence in the room stretched out uncomfortable and sharp until Vivian decided it was time to play her hand. She cleared her throat, a sharp, authoritative sound that demanded attention. "Kendra?" She began, her tone dripping with fake maternal concern. "We all want to handle this as peacefully as possible. Terrence is willing to be generous, but you need to be realistic." Vivian leaned forward, pointing a manicured finger at the thick stack of settlement papers resting in front of me. "You need to sign the paperwork forfeiting your premarital real estate. Terrence has a real family to provide for now. The baby is going to need security, and those properties will ensure my grandchild has a proper future." I stared at her, letting her words hang in the air. She was talking about the real estate portfolio I had built with my own blood, sweat, and tears before I even knew Terrence existed. Properties I had saved for, invested in, and managed meticulously. And Vivian was sitting there with a straight face demanding I hand over a $1.2 million portfolio to the man who cheated on me and the stepsister who betrayed me, all in the name of providing for a real family. Jasmine took her cue. She rubbed her belly theatrically, tracing the curve of the fabric, gazing lovingly at Terrence before turning her eyes to me. The smugness radiating from her was almost a physical force. She leaned forward, reaching into her designer handbag, a bag I recognized because I had bought it for her birthday 2 years ago. She pulled out her wallet, extracted a crisp $1 bill, and placed it on the table. With one long acrylic nail, she slid the dollar across the smooth wood, the green paper gliding silently until it bumped gently against my folded hands. "Buy yourself a bus ticket." "Kendra," she whispered, her voice soft but laced with venom. "Go start over somewhere else. Leave the city. Terrence and I need peace to raise our child without your bitter energy hovering over us." I looked down at the dollar bill, then I looked at the diamond ring on her finger. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. The sheer audacity of her disrespect was breathtaking, but it only solidified the cold resolve hardening in my veins. I slowly shifted my gaze from Jasmine to Terrence. He was staring at the legal pad in front of him, chewing on the inside of his cheek. "Is this really how you want to play it, Terrence?" I asked, my voice perfectly level, stripped of all emotion. I wanted him to look at me. I wanted him to say the words out loud. Terrence finally lifted his head, though his eyes still avoided mine. He swallowed hard, looking anywhere but at the woman he had vowed to love. "Kendra, please just sign the papers," he muttered, his voice tight and defensive. "You know I have to think about my bloodline now. I have responsibilities as a father. A child changes everything. You have your career, you will be fine. Just make this easy for everyone so we can all move on. Bloodline. Responsibilities. Make this easy." Every word out of his mouth was a cowardly justification for his betrayal. He was hiding behind the concept of fatherhood to excuse his greed and his infidelity. He actually believed that getting my stepsister pregnant entitled him to the assets I had worked my entire adult life to secure. He believed I would just fold up and disappear because they had wounded my pride. I looked at the settlement papers sitting in front of me, hundreds of pages designed to strip me of my wealth and hand it over to the people who had stabbed me in the back. I reached out, placing my hands flat on top of the stack. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I pushed the entire stack away from me. The heavy thud of the paper sliding across the table echoed in the silent room. "I am not signing anything," I said. Vivian sat up straight, her eyes flashing with anger. "Kendra, stop being difficult," she snapped, dropping the fake supportive act. "You have no leverage here. Terrence is filing for a disproportionate share of the assets based on his need to care for his dependent. You are holding up the inevitable." I ignored my stepmother completely. I turned my head and gave a single slight nod to Elias, my lawyer, who had been sitting silently beside me the entire time watching the performance. Elias was a seasoned attorney who had seen every dirty trick in divorce court, but even he had a look of quiet anticipation in his eyes. Elias did not speak. He simply reached out and rested his large hand on a thick manila folder sitting off to the side. The room suddenly felt incredibly small. The smug smiles on Vivian and Jasmine began to waver, replaced by a creeping uncertainty. Terrence finally looked at me, his brow furrowing in confusion. They thought they had orchestrated the perfect ambush. They thought they had backed me into a corner using guilt and public humiliation to force my hand. But they did not know the truth. They did not know that long before I sat down at this table, I had completely dismantled their entire reality. To understand how we arrived at the precipice of their total destruction, you have to understand the nightmare that started exactly 3 months earlier. 3 months ago, the air in my home smelled of roasted garlic rosemary and expensive champagne. It was the night of our 5th wedding anniversary. I had hired a private chef to cater an intimate dinner party for our immediate family. The house, a sprawling 5-bedroom estate in the heart of Atlanta, was filled with warm, ambient lighting and the soft sounds of classic rhythm and blues playing from the surround sound speakers. I bought this house 2 years before Terrence even walked into my life, but I happily let him play king of the castle. I loved him. I trusted him. I thought we were building an unbreakable partnership. The evening felt like a genuine triumph. We had survived the difficult early years of marriage, the career shifts, the stressful tax seasons that kept me at the office until midnight. I looked around my living room and felt a deep, settling sense of pride. Malik, Terrence's older brother, was holding court by the marble fireplace, telling an exaggerated story about their college fraternity days. The room echoed with genuine laughter. Chloe, Malik's wife, sat quietly on the velvet sofa, sipping a glass of Pinot Noir. Chloe was a sharp, observant white woman who always seemed to exist on the fringe of our family dynamics. Vivian made no secret of her disdain for Malik marrying outside their culture, and Jasmine often treated Chloe like she was invisible. Chloe and I were not exactly best friends, but we shared a silent, mutual understanding. We were the women who married into this family, and we both knew how to read a room. Across the room, my stepmother Vivian was doing what she did best, holding a glass of my top-shelf wine while finding small things to complain about. She stood near the dining table, adjusting the floral arrangements, criticizing the caterer's choice of napkins, and loudly reminding everyone about Jasmine's recent promotion at some vague marketing firm. Jasmine was not even there yet, and she was an hour late, but Vivian was already paving the way for her grand entrance, making sure my anniversary dinner still somehow centered around her biological daughter. I ignored it. I was so used to Vivian prioritizing Jasmine that I barely registered the disrespect anymore. Tonight was about Terrence and me. At 8 o'clock, Terrence stood at the head of the long dining table. He wore a tailored charcoal suit I had bought him to celebrate his recent promotion. He looked handsome, confident, and completely relaxed. He tapped his silver knife against the rim of his crystal champagne flute. The melodic ringing cut through the chatter, and the music instantly silencing the room. Everyone turned to look at him, raising their glasses in anticipation. I sat at the opposite end of the table, looking down at my husband with a heart full of absolute devotion. Terrence smiled, showing those perfect teeth that had charmed me from day one. He started his toast by thanking everyone for coming together to celebrate half a decade of marriage. Then he looked directly into my eyes. The words he spoke next would burn themselves into my memory, serving as the ultimate proof of his deception. He called me his rock. He called me his foundation. He told our family that he could never have achieved his success without my unwavering loyalty and support. He raised his glass higher, declaring that I was the only woman who truly understood him, the queen of his heart, and the architect of his happiness. He promised the next 5 years would be even better than the last. The sheer hypocrisy of that speech still turns my stomach today. Before the guests could even bring their glasses together to cheer, the heavy oak front door of the house swung open and slammed violently against the entryway wall. The sound cracked through the foyer like a gunshot. Everyone froze. The glasses hovered in mid-air. Terrence's smile instantly vanished from his face. Jasmine stood in the doorway, clutching her designer purse, breathing heavily, as if she had just sprinted for miles. She was exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes late. But looking at her posture, you would think she had just escaped a burning building. She wore a fitted beige wrap dress that hugged her curves tightly. Her face was buried in her hands and a loud theatrical sob ripped from her throat. My analytical mind, the auditor inside me, immediately began processing the scene. Even through her heavy dramatic sobbing, I noticed the details. Her shoulders were heaving, portraying utter devastation, but her makeup was completely immaculate. There were no dark streaks of mascara running down her cheeks. Her foundation was flawless. Her lip gloss was perfectly applied. It was a masterclass in manufactured sorrow designed entirely for maximum audience impact. Vivian immediately abandoned her wine glass on the table and rushed forward, her heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. "Jasmine, baby, what is wrong?" Vivian cried out, wrapping her arms around her daughter and pulling her directly into the dining room where the light was brightest. She guided her right into the center of the audience, ensuring every single pair of eyes was locked onto them. I looked over at Terrence. He was standing perfectly still at the head of the table. The confident, loving husband from 10 seconds ago had been entirely erased. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, watching the ground crumble beneath his feet. He did not rush forward to ask if she was okay. He did not look concerned. He looked terrified. Jasmine ignored her mother's comforting pats. She pushed past Vivian and walked right into the center of the room, stepping directly into the physical space between me and Terrence. She stood there looking at the shocked faces of my in-laws, my friends, and my husband. The soft rhythm and blues music continued to play from the overhead speakers, creating a bizarre soundtrack to the heavy, suffocating silence that had swallowed the party. Jasmine let out another calculated sob, bringing a manicured hand up to wipe an invisible tear from her pristine cheek. "I have to tell you all something," she said, her voice shaking with perfectly practiced vulnerability. "I cannot hide it anymore. I cannot keep this secret while you all sit here celebrating a lie." Jasmine stood there, letting the word lie hang in the heavy air. I looked at her stomach. The beige wrap dress was tied just tightly enough to accentuate a very slight curve. She placed both of her hands over her lower abdomen, adopting the classic maternal pose. "I am 4 months pregnant," she announced. Her voice cracked right on cue, sounding fragile and overwhelmed. The room went completely dead. The soft rhythm and blues music playing from the overhead speakers suddenly sounded absurdly loud and inappropriate. I could hear the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding violently in my ears. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. We were all trapped in a bizarre, sudden paralysis. The joyful anniversary atmosphere vanished instantly, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. Malik was the first person to break the trance. He took a heavy step forward, setting his bourbon glass down hard on the marble mantel. His brow was deeply furrowed in confusion. Jasmine Malik said, his voice low and demanding, "Congratulations, but why are you crashing into Kendra and Terrence's anniversary dinner to announce this? What lie are you talking about? Who is the father?" Jasmine did not look at Malik. She did not look at me. She turned her head slowly and locked her tear-filled eyes directly onto Terrence. She stood there staring at my husband, her bottom lip trembling violently. She let out a loud, gut-wrenching sob, covered her face with both hands, and let her shoulders shake. I turned my head to look at the man I had married. I expected him to look outraged. I expected him to demand why she was staring at him like that. I expected him to defend our home, our marriage, and our dignity from this absolute insanity. Instead, Terrence looked like he had been struck by a high-voltage current. The warm, confident color drained completely from his face, leaving a sickly grayish pallor behind. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His chest stopped moving. His fingers went completely slack. The crystal champagne flute he had been holding high in the air just moments before slipped right through his grip. It hit the hardwood floor with a violent crash. The sharp sound of shattering glass made several guests in the room flinch. Expensive vintage champagne splattered across the polished wood, flying up to soak into the cuffs of his tailored charcoal trousers. He did not bend down to clean it up. He did not say a word. He just stared blankly at the broken shards of crystal glittering in the spilled alcohol at his feet. In the financial auditing world, we call it a silent admission. When a discrepancy is found when the numbers do not add up, and the party in question offers no defense, no alternative explanation, and no immediate pushback, their silence is the loudest confession possible. Terrence's silence screamed through my dining room. He did not deny it. He did not yell at her to get out of our house. He just stood there absolutely frozen in his own guilt. The gravity of the moment crashed into me like a physical blow to the sternum. My brain, inherently wired to track timelines and calculate data, went into overdrive. 4 months pregnant, 16 weeks, 112 days. That meant this happened right around my 35th birthday, right around the time Terrence told me he had an emergency weekend corporate retreat in Miami. I remembered the sudden spike in his credit card charges for client dinners that month. I remembered him working late and coming home smelling like hotel soap. The math calculated instantly in my head, clicking into place with cold, brutal precision. He had been looking me in the face, kissing me good morning, and sleeping in my bed while knowing he had planted a child in my stepsister. I felt 30 pairs of eyes shift from the shattered glass on the floor directly to me. My in-laws, my friends, my colleagues. They were all watching me, waiting for me to react, waiting for me to scream or throw a china plate or collapse onto the floor in a puddle of humiliated tears. The air in my lungs felt thick and heavy. I looked over at Chloe. She was sitting stiffly on the velvet sofa, her wine glass suspended halfway to her mouth. Her blue eyes were wide with shock, but as she looked from Jasmine to Terrence, her expression hardened into pure, unfiltered disgust. She saw it too. We all saw it. The public humiliation washed over me like a wave of boiling water. This was not a private confession in the safety of a therapist's office. This was a highly calculated tactical strike. Jasmine had waited until my house was full of the people whose opinions mattered most to me. She waited until Terrence had just publicly declared his undying devotion to me. She maximized the collateral damage to ensure I was stripped of my dignity in front of my entire social and professional circle. My face burned with shame, but my posture remained completely rigid. A normal woman might have lost her mind in that exact second. A normal woman might have lunged across the dining table and dragged her stepsister out by her hair. But I was trapped inside my own analytical mind, watching my life burn to the ground in high definition. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand that Terrence look me in the eye and confess it out loud. But before I could even form the words, the true orchestrator of this nightmare took the stage. Vivian moved with a speed and purpose that completely betrayed her age. She did not look shocked. She did not look appalled that her biological daughter had just announced a scandalous affair with her stepdaughter's husband. She looked prepared. Vivian threw her arms around Jasmine, shielding her from the judgmental stares of the room. She stroked Jasmine's hair, pulling her head onto her shoulder. My poor baby Vivian cooed loudly, ensuring her voice carried over the stunned silence. You have been carrying this heavy burden all by yourself. It is okay. Mama is here. The truth will set you free. I stared at my stepmother, the woman who had helped me pick out my wedding dress, the woman who had prayed over our marriage at the altar. She was holding the woman who had just destroyed my family, treating her like a holy martyr. Vivian then did the unthinkable. She turned her sharp, judging eyes away from Jasmine and locked them dead onto me. She did not look at Terrence, the man who had supposedly cheated. She looked at me, the betrayed wife. And with an audience of my closest friends and family standing right there in my own dining room, Vivian took a deep breath and completely hijacked the narrative. Kendra, you need to look at your own actions before you start casting stones. Vivian's voice rang out clear and unwavering, slicing through the shocked silence of the dining room. She tightened her grip on Jasmine, rubbing her shoulders like a protective mother bear. You have been so obsessed with your spreadsheets and your audits. You work 80-hour weeks, you travel. You left this poor man alone in this big house while you chased your promotions and built your real estate portfolio. You neglected your husband, Kendra. Jasmine gave him the warmth and the attention he desperately needed. A man needs a wife, not a business partner. Vivian actually looked around the room as if expecting our guests to nod in agreement. There is an innocent child involved now. A baby. You need to step aside for the sake of the child. Do the right thing and step aside. I felt the floor drop out from underneath me. The audacity of her words felt like a physical assault. My own stepmother, the woman who had lived under my father's roof, the woman I had cared for financially and emotionally, was standing in my dining room justifying my husband's infidelity by weaponizing my career against me. She was blaming my ambition for his betrayal. She was elevating her biological daughter, the mistress, to the status of a savior who just wanted to give a lonely man some affection. The guests were completely paralyzed. The joyful anniversary dinner had morphed into a grotesque spectacle. Malik Terrence's brother broke the spell. He set his jaw, shook his head in absolute disgust, and grabbed his wife's hand. "Come on, Chloe! We are leaving," Malik muttered. Chloe gave me one long look of profound sympathy before letting her husband lead her out the front door. That was the signal. Like water draining from a cracked basin, the rest of the guests suddenly scrambled to escape. Friends avoided my gaze. Family members whispered awkward apologies as they grabbed their coats. Within 10 minutes, the grand house was completely empty, save for the catered food growing cold on the table and the shattered champagne glass still glittering on the hardwood floor. Vivian and Jasmine had slipped out during the mass exodus, leaving me alone with the man who had just blown my life to pieces. I found Terrence upstairs in the master bedroom. He was frantically pulling clothes from his closet and shoving them into a black leather duffel bag. It was the exact same duffel bag I had purchased for his birthday last year. "Terrence," I said, leaning against the door frame. My voice was eerily calm, stripped of all the hysteria he probably expected. "Look at me." He froze. His broad shoulders hunched forward, but he refused to turn around. He kept his back to me, staring down at the half-packed bag. He was a coward, unable to face the destruction he had caused. "Look at me," I repeated, my tone dropping an octave colder. He finally turned slowly, keeping his eyes focused on the floorboards near my feet. "I am sorry, Kendra," he mumbled. His voice was completely devoid of the booming confidence he had possessed during his toast just an hour earlier. "It was a mistake. It was just one night. I had too much to drink at a hotel bar and Jasmine was there. She listened to me. I was stressed. I was stupid. But now she is pregnant." He grabbed a handful of ties and stuffed them into the side pocket of the bag, pulling the zipper shut with a loud, sharp screech. "I have to do the right thing," he said, grabbing the heavy leather handles. "It is my child, Kendra. I have to protect my bloodline. I have a responsibility to be a father to that baby." He used the concept of duty to mask his absolute betrayal. He wrapped his infidelity in the noble cloak of fatherhood, as if abandoning his wife for her stepsister was some sort of heroic sacrifice. He slung the bag over his shoulder and walked toward the door. He had to pass right by me to leave. I did not move out of his way. He had to turn sideways, brushing against the doorframe to avoid touching me. "I will call you tomorrow," he whispered, keeping his head down as he walked past me into the hallway. "We will sort out the logistics." I did not answer him. I just turned and watched him walk down the stairs. I listened to his heavy footsteps cross the foyer. I heard the front door open and then close with a heavy, definitive click. The locking mechanism engaged, sealing me inside. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. I stood alone in the master bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of a marriage that had just been erased. Downstairs, the remnants of our anniversary dinner sat rotting on fine china. Upstairs, the empty hangers in Terrence's closet swayed slightly from the force of his departure. The psychological impact began to set in, wrapping around my chest like a tight iron band. I had spent years building this life. I had worked late nights, crunched numbers, audited accounts, and invested wisely to ensure we had a beautiful, secure future. And in the span of 1 hour, my stepsister had stolen my husband. My stepmother had publicly humiliated me, and my husband had walked out the door to protect his so-called bloodline. I sat down on the edge of the perfectly made bed. I did not shed a single tear. The sting of my family's betrayal was too deep, too profound for crying. My mind was already categorizing the damage, assessing the liabilities, and bracing for the fallout. I thought the worst was over. I thought the public humiliation and the abandonment were the deepest cuts they could inflict. But I was entirely wrong. They had not just come for my marriage. They were coming for everything I owned, and the true financial warfare was set to begin the very next morning. The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of the master bedroom, casting long shadows across the empty space where Terence used to sleep. I had not slept a single minute. My mind had been running complex algorithms, calculating the trajectory of a divorce, the division of assets, and the potential liabilities. At exactly 6 in the morning, my auditor instincts kicked into high gear. Trust is a luxury in my profession, and Terence had just bankrupted his account with me. I walked down the hall to my home office, a space Vivian had always criticized as being too masculine for a married woman. I sat at my mahogany desk, booted up my laptop, and logged into our joint banking portal. I expected to see a few unauthorized charges, maybe a hotel booking or a flight. What I saw instead made the air rush completely out of my lungs. The available balance on our primary joint savings account read $0.00. I hit refresh, thinking it must be a server error. The screen blinked and reloaded, displaying the exact same terrifying number: $150,000. The entire nest egg we had built together, the liquid cash I had meticulously saved and managed, was completely gone. The transaction log showed a single massive wire transfer executed at 3 in the morning, just hours after he had walked out of my house. Before I could even pick up my phone to call the fraud department, the screen on my cell lit up. It was a text message from Terence. It read, "Kendra, I had to move the funds to a secure private account. Jasmine's pregnancy is considered high risk, and the specialized medical expenses are already mounting. I am doing the responsible thing for my child. We will sort out the rest later with the lawyers. Please do not make this harder than it has to be." I stared at the glowing text message. He had stolen my life savings in the middle of the night and had the absolute nerve to frame it as responsible parenting. He was funding his new life with his mistress, using the money I had earned auditing financial statements. The sheer cowardice of a text message sent after the bank transfer had cleared ignited a cold, burning fury deep inside my chest. This was no longer just an infidelity issue. This was financial abuse. This was financial warfare. He had crossed a line that I was professionally trained to obliterate. I took a screenshot of the message, downloaded the wire transfer confirmation, and saved everything to an encrypted cloud drive. I did not text him back. Let him think I was panicking. Let him think he had outsmarted me. 3 days passed. 3 days of deafening silence from my husband, and a flurry of quiet legal preparations on my end. Then Sunday morning arrived. In the heart of Atlanta, the Sunday church service is not just a place of worship. It is the epicenter of social currency, community standing, and public perception. My family belonged to a highly prominent church, one where Vivian sat on several influential committees and served as a pillar of the congregation. A lesser woman would have hidden in her house, too ashamed to face the whispers and the pitying glances. But I was not going to let them run me out of my own community. I chose my outfit with tactical precision. I wore a tailored navy blue suit, immaculate makeup, and kept my head held high. I drove to the sanctuary, parked my car, and walked up the wide stone steps toward the heavy double doors. The moment I stepped into the sprawling, brightly lit foyer, the atmosphere shifted. It was palpable. Conversations abruptly halted. Eyes darted in my direction before quickly averting. The usual warm greetings and hugs from the ushers were replaced by stiff, awkward nods. I walked down the main aisle toward my usual pew. The air felt thick with unspoken judgment. I could hear the hushed whispers rippling through the congregation like a fast-moving current. I kept my posture perfectly straight, scanning the room until my eyes landed on the third row. There they were, Vivian and Jasmine sitting right in the center, surrounded by a cluster of the most influential elder women in the church. Vivian had her arm wrapped protectively around Jasmine, who was wearing a soft pastel maternity dress, intentionally drawing attention to her stomach. Jasmine was dabbing at her eyes with a lace tissue, playing the role of the overwhelmed but blessed expectant mother. Vivian was leaning in, whispering to the pastor's wife, shaking her head with a look of profound sorrow. They had already spun the narrative. They had weaponized my ambition and turned it into my greatest sin. I could see the story written on the faces of the women looking back at me. To them, I was the cold, barren, career-obsessed wife. I was the woman who cared more about spreadsheets and property deeds than building a warm Christian home. In their eyes, I had driven a good, God-fearing man into the arms of a younger, softer, more nurturing woman. Jasmine was not a homewrecker to them. She was a tragic heroine stepping up to give Terence the family I had supposedly denied him. Sister Beatrice, a woman who had known me since I was a teenager, intercepted me before I could reach my seat. She placed a heavy hand on my arm and looked at me with a mixture of pity and severe judgment. "Kendra, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice loud enough for the surrounding pews to hear. "We are praying for your heart. We know it must be hard for you to see Terence stepping up to take responsibility for the new life God has blessed him with. Pride is a terrible burden to carry. Sometimes the Lord removes our blessings when we fail to prioritize our husbands." The sheer audacity of her words felt like a physical slap across the face. They were actually framing my husband's infidelity as divine retribution for my career success. Vivian locked eyes with me from the front row. A smug, triumphant smile played at the corners of her mouth before she quickly masked it with a look of pious concern. She had successfully orchestrated a character assassination, executing a flawless smear campaign right inside the walls of my own church. She had rallied the community against me, isolating me completely. I gently but firmly removed Sister Beatrice's hand from my arm. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of the devastation threatening to crush me. "I will keep your prayers in mind." "Sister Beatrice," I said smoothly, my tone absolutely lethal. "Though I suggest you save them for those who build their houses on a foundation of lies." I walked past her and took my seat, sitting tall and unbothered through the entire service. The icy stares burned into my back for 2 straight hours, but I refused to break. I knew that letting them see me bleed was exactly what Vivian wanted. She wanted me to run away in shame, leaving the social battlefield entirely to her and Jasmine. She thought she had stripped me of my money, my husband, and my reputation. She thought she had won. But as I sat there listening to the choir sing, I was already mapping out the financial forensic audit that would expose every single one of their sins to the harsh light of day. They had picked a fight with the wrong woman. As soon as the final blessing was given, I gathered my purse and walked out the sanctuary doors, stepping out into the warm Atlanta sun, heading straight toward a downtown coffee shop where the real work would begin. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of an upscale Buckhead coffee shop, the air conditioning providing a sharp welcome shock to my system after the suffocating heat of the church sanctuary. I found a secluded booth in the far back corner, completely hidden from the large bay windows and the noisy chatter of the Sunday brunch crowd. I ordered a large black coffee, opened my laptop, and went straight to work. I did not shed a single tear on the drive over. I did not sit in my car and scream. I simply transitioned into the one version of myself that nobody could break. The auditor. Terence thought he was clever. He thought moving $150,000 in the dead of night was a clean getaway, a preemptive strike to secure his new life before the divorce lawyers could freeze our assets. But Terence was a software developer, not a forensic accountant. He understood code, but I understood money. And money always leaves a footprint. You cannot move 6 figures through the American banking system without triggering a dozen different tracking mechanisms. I pulled up our joint banking portal and isolated the transaction identification number from the wire transfer. The funds had bounced from our primary savings to a newly opened checking account in his name, and then immediately routed out to a third-party vendor. The description line on the wire transfer simply read, "Specialized Medical Services, LLC." I cracked my knuckles and began running that limited liability company through the state public business registry. I was completely dialed in. The grief and the public humiliation had been compartmentalized, locked away in a dark mental box I would deal with later. Right now, I was a predator tracking a scent. "You are looking at the wrong numbers." The voice cut through my intense concentration like a sharp blade. I looked up. Standing over my booth holding a steaming paper cup was Chloe. She did not ask if the seat was taken. She simply slid into the leather booth directly across from me, placing her coffee gently on the table and folding her hands in front of her. Chloe was 34, fiercely intelligent and entirely unimpressed by my family's theatrics. She was a white woman, married to Terrence's older brother Malik, and she had always been treated as an unwanted outsider by Vivian and Jasmine. Vivian liked her daughters-in-law, easily controlled, traditionally compliant, and perfectly molded to fit the image of her prominent Atlanta church family. Chloe was none of those things. She worked as a ruthless commercial real estate appraiser, spoke her mind with brutal efficiency, and had spent the last 6 years navigating the active minefield of my stepmother's passive-aggressive holiday dinners. We were not particularly close. I was always too buried in my audits and tax seasons to forge a deep friendship, and she was always deliberately seated at the farthest end of the table by Vivian. But over the years, Chloe and I had shared a mutual unspoken understanding. We were both independent women who had married into a family that demanded absolute submission to its matriarch. "Did Malik send you to do a welfare check?" I asked, my voice guarded. I kept my hands hovering over my keyboard, ready to close the laptop screen at a moment's notice. "Malik is currently sitting in our living room, pacing the floor, and trying to figure out how to defend his little brother's sudden descent into absolute madness," Chloe replied, taking a slow sip of her coffee. "He thinks Terrence just had a moment of weakness. He thinks this is a tragic consequence of a broken marriage. But Malik is blind to his own family's garbage. I am not." I studied her face. There was no pity in her bright blue eyes, no patronizing sorrow like the churchwomen had offered me just an hour ago. There was only sharp, cold calculation. "So why are you here, Chloe?" I asked, leaning back against the leather booth. "If you are not playing peacemaker for the brothers, what exactly do you want?" Chloe leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, cutting the physical distance between us. "I hate a liar, Kendra. I hate being asked to sit in a dining room and watch a poorly acted soap opera, and I especially hate watching a smart woman like you get taken out by a manipulative parasite like Jasmine." Chloe let out a dry, humorless laugh that held zero warmth. "Vivian has spent 6 years making sure I knew I was an outsider. She criticized my wedding, she criticized my career, she even criticized the way I decorate my own house. Jasmine treated me like the hired help at every family function, rolling her eyes whenever I spoke. I owe those two women absolutely nothing. And when I watched them orchestrate that hit job on you at your anniversary dinner, I knew exactly what I was looking at." "And what was that?" I asked, lowering my laptop screen just an inch. "A shakedown," Chloe said flatly, her gaze piercing right through me. "A highly coordinated financial and emotional shakedown. You are being played, Kendra. The whole thing is a massive setup, and Terrence is too stupid and too guilty to see it." I felt the familiar hum of adrenaline rush through my veins. The validation of hearing someone else say it out loud, someone totally disconnected from my own emotional bias, was incredibly powerful. "Terrence drained our joint savings account last night." I told her, the words tasting like battery acid in my mouth. $150,000. He claims it is for high-risk medical expenses for the pregnancy. I am tracking the routing numbers right now. Chloe's expression did not change. She just nodded slowly, as if this confirmed a theory she had already mapped out in her head. Of course he did. Hit the guilty husband with an urgent medical crisis, isolate him from the rational wife, and bleed the accounts dry before anyone can ask for a second opinion. She leaned back in the booth, crossing her arms defensively. "But Terrence is a fool, and Jasmine is sloppy. She has always been incredibly sloppy." I closed my laptop completely. The dynamic between us shifted instantly, cementing a new reality. We were no longer just two sisters-in-law sharing awkward small talk at Thanksgiving. We were two professionals breaking down a crime scene. We both dealt in facts, figures, and tangible assets. What do you know, Chloe? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. I know that a woman who is 4 months along with a supposedly high-risk fragile pregnancy does not behave the way Jasmine has been behaving when she thinks nobody from the family is watching. Chloe said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. They think because I am the outsider, I am invisible to them. They think I do not pay attention to what they do outside the walls of that church. They forget that invisible people see absolutely everything. I stared at her, feeling the heavy weight of the moment. Chloe was not here to offer me a shoulder to cry on. She was here to hand me a loaded weapon. She had pieces of a puzzle I did not even realize I was putting together. The raw betrayal of my family had clouded my vision, but Chloe was operating with absolute clarity. She saw the cracks in Jasmine's flawless victim routine, and she was ready to tear the entire facade wide open. I waited for Chloe to continue. The coffee shop around us faded into white noise. Chloe took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee, setting the cup down with a soft click against the saucer. 3 days ago, I had a client lunch at the Piedmont Country Club. Chloe began, her voice dropping to a low, steady cadence. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The place was mostly empty, just a few real estate developers and ladies who lunch. I was sitting on the terrace going over some commercial zoning permits when I heard that unmistakable high-pitched laugh. I looked over my menu and saw your stepsister sitting 2 tables away with her best friend. I kept my face perfectly still, but my mind was already racing. Jasmine claimed she was bedridden with severe morning sickness and crippling fatigue. That was the excuse Vivian gave the church congregation for Jasmine needing Terrence to immediately step up and provide financial support. She was wearing a tight silk sundress. Chloe continued, locking her sharp blue eyes onto mine. But here is the interesting part, Kendra. For a woman who was supposedly suffering from a high-risk fragile pregnancy, she certainly had an impressive appetite. I watched her order and consume 3 mimosas, not virgin mimosas. I saw the bartender pour the champagne, and then she ordered the grand sushi boat. She sat there for 2 hours eating raw, unpasteurized tuna and throwing back alcohol. The auditor inside me registered the data points immediately. The medical impossibility of her behavior was glaring. A woman carrying a high-risk pregnancy, especially one deemed fragile enough to require a sudden emergency withdrawal of $150,000, does not consume raw seafood and heavy alcohol in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. It was a statistical zero probability. It defied every basic rule of maternal health care. But that is not even the best part, Chloe said, leaning closer across the small table. I am a highly observant woman, Kendra. You have to be in my line of work. I noticed structural inconsistencies. I looked at her stomach under that silk dress. Last week at the church fundraiser, her bump was sitting low, heavy, and quite prominent. But 3 days ago at the country club, that same bump was sitting impossibly high and looked at least 2 months smaller. It is a biological miracle. Jasmine's baby bump seems to drastically change sizes depending entirely on the audience she is performing for. A cold prickle of realization began to crawl up the back of my neck. My mind flashed back to the anniversary dinner. Jasmine clutching her stomach. The beige wrap dress tied just perfectly to accentuate the curve. The theatrical rubbing of her lower abdomen. Are you telling me you think she is exaggerating the pregnancy? I asked, keeping my voice barely above a whisper. Chloe let out a dark, humorless chuckle. I am telling you there is no pregnancy, Kendra. I am telling you your husband is the biggest idiot in the state of Georgia, and your stepmother is running a masterclass in extortion. I stared at her. The implication was massive. It was one thing to exaggerate symptoms to manipulate a guilty man. It was an entirely different universe of fraud to completely fabricate a child. You need proof to make an accusation like that, I said, my tone purely transactional. I do not deal in theories, Chloe. I deal in hard documentation. If I am going to take this to a lawyer, I need paper. Chloe reached into her expensive leather handbag. I know you do. That is why I am sitting here. She explained that Terrence had been acting increasingly paranoid over the last few weeks. Knowing that I managed all the finances at our house, Terrence was terrified of a stray bank statement or delivery tipping me off to his sudden, massive expenditures. He asked his brother Malik to let him use their home address as a temporary mail drop. Malik, blindly loyal to his little brother, agreed without asking any questions. He intercepted the packages and kept them hidden in the trunk of his car, waiting to hand them off to Terrence. But Malik leaves his keys on the kitchen counter, Chloe said, a sharp, triumphant gleam in her eye. And I do not respect boundaries when my husband is aiding and abetting a cowardly cheater. I went into his car yesterday morning. I opened the trunk and I checked the mail. Chloe pulled her hand out of her purse. Her fingers were pinching a crumpled piece of white paper. She placed it flat on the wooden table between us and used her manicured nails to smooth out the creases. She did not say a word. She just slid it slowly across the table until it rested directly under my gaze. I looked down at the document. It was a packing slip and purchase receipt. The logo at the top belonged to an online specialty studio located in Los Angeles, a company catering to theatrical productions and the film industry. I scanned down to the billing information. The purchaser was listed as Vivian, my stepmother. The shipping address was Malik and Chloe's house, with Terrence listed as the recipient and care of. Then my eyes hit the itemized description line. One high-end medical-grade silicone theatrical belly, 6-month gestation. Custom caramel skin tone blending, adhesive backing included. The total price was $4,500. The breath left my lungs in one long, jagged exhale. The words on the page burned themselves into my retinas. High-end medical-grade silicone. The sheer audacity of the scam hit me like a freight train. There was no baby. There was no high-risk pregnancy. There was no tragic, fragile miracle that required Terrence to step up and be a father. It was a piece of expensive molded rubber strapped to my stepsister's waist with professional adhesive. The $150,000 Terrence had drained from our life savings in the middle of the night. He had left a text message claiming it was for specialized medical expenses. He was bleeding himself dry, paying for phantom doctor visits, fake ultrasound appointments, and imaginary prenatal treatments. Terrence, in his overwhelming guilt and stupidity, had fallen for the oldest extortion trick in the book, and he was funding the entire scam with my hard-earned money. I reached out and placed my hand flat over the receipt, feeling the textured paper under my palm. The betrayal was no longer just emotional. It was a highly coordinated, predatory financial crime. Vivian and Jasmine had weaponized Terrence's infidelity against him, using a silicone prop to extract maximum capital before the divorce could even be filed. They knew Terrence was a coward. They knew he would panic at the thought of a scandal, and they knew he would pay whatever they demanded to keep the situation contained. I looked up at Chloe. She was watching me closely, waiting for the tears or the breakdown. She was waiting to see if I would crumble under the weight of this grotesque revelation. But I did not crumble. The grief, the heartbreak, the agonizing question of why I was not enough for my husband, it all vanished. It evaporated completely, replaced by the cold, calculating hum of a financial auditor who had just found the smoking gun in a massive corporate fraud case. "Can I keep this?" I asked, my voice steady and completely devoid of fear. Chloe smiled, a genuine, sharp smile of approval. "It is yours, Kendra. Do whatever you have to do. Burn them to the ground." I folded the receipt with meticulous precision, sliding it safely into the inner zippered pocket of my suit jacket. The puzzle pieces were falling into place with lethal clarity. If there was no clinic and no medical expenses, then the $150,000 had to be sitting somewhere else. I had the transaction identification number. I had the routing data. Now I had the motivation. The money did not go to a doctor. It went to a thief. And I was going to follow that digital paper trail right to Vivian's front door. "Thank you, Chloe," I said, gathering my laptop and sliding out of the booth. "You have no idea what you just handed me." I walked out of the coffee shop with a completely different posture than when I walked in. I was no longer the discarded wife seeking refuge from the judging eyes of a church congregation. I was the executioner, and my first stop was going to be the digital footprint of that phantom medical clinic. Terrence was about to learn a very expensive lesson about the women he chose to trust. I drove back to my house in absolute silence. The radio was off. My phone was on Do Not Disturb. The tears that had threatened to fall during the church service were completely gone, dried up, and replaced by cold, hard adrenaline. I walked through the front door of the 5-bedroom estate Terrence had just abandoned. The silence in the hallway no longer felt heavy or oppressive. It felt like a clean operating room. I bypassed the master bedroom entirely and went straight into my home office. I locked the door behind me. I took off my tailored navy blue suit jacket, draped it over the back of my chair, and rolled up my sleeves. I placed the crumpled receipt Chloe had given me flat on the center of my mahogany desk. It was the physical anchor to the digital war I was about to wage. In my line of work as a senior financial auditor, you learn very quickly that human beings lie. Husbands lie. Stepmothers lie. Stepsisters crying theatrical tears in the middle of anniversary dinners lie. But numbers never lie. Spreadsheets do not have emotional affairs. Bank routing codes do not gaslight you in front of a church congregation. When you remove the emotion from a betrayal, what you are left with is a transaction. Terrence had executed a transaction of $150,000. He thought he was buying his way out of guilt and securing medical care for his unborn child. I knew he was just the mark in a highly orchestrated con. Now I needed to prove it with a paper trail so undeniable it would hold up in a court of law. I booted up my encrypted work laptop. I connected to a secure virtual private network. I logged back into the joint banking portal that Terrence had drained. I pulled up the exact wire transfer log from 3 in the morning. The destination was listed as Specialized Medical Services, LLC. To a panicked, guilty husband, that sounded legitimate enough. To an auditor, it sounded like a red flag wrapped in neon lights. Real medical facilities do not use generic corporate monikers for incoming wire transfers from personal checking accounts. They use established billing departments with highly specific merchant classification codes. I needed the exact destination of those funds. I accessed my professional financial databases. Databases that cost thousands of dollars a year to maintain, databases that Terrence had no idea I could access right from my home office. I pulled the wire transfer trace tracking the clearinghouse reference number. I isolated the receiving bank account and ran a reverse search on the routing data. Within 45 minutes, I had the employer identification number, the tax routing number attached to Specialized Medical Services, LLC. I took that 9-digit tax number and plugged it directly into the Georgia Secretary of State Public Business Registry. The search icon spun for exactly 3 seconds before spitting out the corporate filing documents. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes scanning the digital paperwork. Specialized Medical Services, LLC was not a clinic. It was not a hospital. It was not a maternal health facility. It was a domestic limited liability company registered exactly 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. Right around the time Jasmine announced her miraculous high-risk pregnancy, I dug deeper, running the tax routing number through state medical board licensing databases. If this was a legitimate medical practice treating a high-risk pregnancy, there would be licensed obstetricians, registered nurses, or at least a board-certified medical director attached to the corporate filing. The search results came back completely empty. 0 medical licenses, 0 board certifications, 0 health department inspection records. The entity had absolutely no legal authority to practice medicine, to dispense medical advice, or to bill for healthcare services in the state of Georgia, or any other state for that matter. I needed to see exactly how compromised Terrence actually was. I pulled a hard inquiry on Terrence's credit report, using my legal access as his spouse. The report generated on my screen, and I let out a low whistle. The financial bleeding did not start and end with the $150,000 wire transfer. Over the last 4 weeks, Terrence had opened 3 new high-yield credit cards. 2 of them were already maxed out with cash advances. He had pulled a $40,000 personal loan from a secondary online lender with predatory interest rates. He was drowning himself in high-interest debt, trying to keep up with the demands of a phantom medical crisis. He was liquidating his entire financial future based on the demands of a silicone prop belly. The grief was completely eradicated from my system. Watching my husband bankrupt himself for a lie should have hurt, but all I felt was the clinical satisfaction of a professional untangling a complex web of deceit. Vivian and Jasmine had played a dangerous game. They assumed that because I was a woman betrayed, I would be blinded by sorrow. They expected me to file for a standard divorce cry to my lawyers and walk away licking my wounds while they drained the marital estate. They severely underestimated who they were dealing with. I did not just audit tax returns, I dismantled financial structures, and I was currently holding the sledgehammer. The money did not go to a doctor, but it had to go somewhere. Shell companies are designed to hold funds temporarily before routing them to their final destination. I sat back in my chair, took a sip of cold coffee, and cracked my knuckles again. It was time to find out exactly whose pockets were getting lined with my life savings. I pulled up the registered address for specialized medical services from the state database. The address was listed on a state highway just outside the city limits. I typed the coordinates into a satellite mapping program and switched to the street-level view. I waited a few seconds for the image to render on my high-resolution monitor. The location was not a sleek medical building with glass doors and a pristine waiting room. The image on my screen showed a crumbling asphalt parking lot full of potholes and weeds. It was an abandoned strip mall. The specific suite number attached to the limited liability company belonged to a boarded-up storefront with a faded sign for a discount cellular phone store. A chain-link security fence was pulled tight across the shattered front windows. Graffiti covered the brick walls. This was the high-risk pregnancy clinic. Terrence had wired $150,000 to a ghost town next to a defunct laundromat. He was so paralyzed by the fear of his infidelity being exposed and so blinded by his own guilt that he never bothered to verify where his money was actually going. He just transferred our life savings to a vacant building. But shell accounts are just waiting rooms for stolen money. The funds never stay there. They have to be cleaned and routed to their final destination before anyone notices the discrepancy. I went back to the financial transaction database. I pulled the outward transfer logs for the shell company. The money had rested in that dummy account for exactly 24 hours. Then it was fractured into two distinct electronic transfers. The precision of the split told me everything I needed to know about the people running the scam. They were greedy, but they had a clear hierarchy. I tracked the first transfer. It was a massive wire for $130,000. I followed the digital breadcrumbs as the money moved from the domestic shell account through a correspondent banking hub in New York. From there, the trail left the United States banking system entirely. The funds were wired directly to a private offshore trust account held at a financial institution in the Bahamas. Jasmine was not just playing a short-term game to ruin my marriage. She was building an offshore fortress. She was securing a massive, untraceable payday that would be completely shielded from domestic divorce proceedings, civil lawsuits, or child support audits. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was going to bleed Terrence dry, force him to divorce me, extract every last dollar she could, and then suddenly suffer a tragic, fictional miscarriage. By the time Terrence realized he had given up his wife and his wealth for a silicone prop belly, Jasmine would be sitting on a beach with a six-figure offshore account. It was a brilliant plan for a sociopath, but she made one fatal error. She got her mother involved. I turned my attention to the second outward transfer. The remaining $20,000 did not travel across international waters. It stayed entirely domestic. I highlighted the routing number and the receiving account digits on my screen. I stared at the routing sequence, and a cold realization began to creep up the back of my neck. I recognized those numbers. They belonged to a very specific regional credit union right here in Atlanta. It was the exact same credit union my late father had used for his business accounts. It was the exact same credit union my stepmother Vivian used for her personal banking. I did not want to rely on a hunch. In an audit, a hunch is useless without verifiable documentation. I needed absolute proof. I opened my professional skip tracing software. This is a highly restricted tool I use to locate hidden assets and verify beneficial owners during major corporate mergers. I inputted the receiving bank account number and requested the primary account holder profile. A green loading bar flashed across the dark screen of my laptop. I held my breath. 2 seconds later, the text populated on the screen in stark white letters. The primary account holder was Vivian. I pushed my chair back from the desk. The silence in my office was absolute. I looked at the name on the screen until the letters started to blur together. Vivian was getting a cut. The magnitude of the betrayal expanded, taking on a new, terrifying dimension. Vivian was not just a protective mother shielding her pregnant daughter from the judgment of our church community. She was not just a self-righteous stepmother taking the opportunity to knock me down a peg. She was an active co-conspirator on the payroll. She was a silent partner in a felony extortion ring. I thought back to the anniversary dinner. I pictured Vivian rushing forward in her elegant dress, throwing her arms around Jasmine, pulling her into the center of the dining room. I heard her voice echoing in my memory, blaming my ambition and my career for driving Terrence into Jasmine's bed. I remembered her looking me dead in the eye and telling me to step aside for the sake of the baby. She delivered that entire performance. She humiliated me in front of my closest friends and colleagues, all while knowing she was going to pocket $20,000 of my stolen life savings for her acting skills. And then I thought about the church service this morning. I pictured Vivian sitting in the third pew wearing her Sunday best, surrounded by the most influential women in the congregation. She had played the role of the tragic but faithful matriarch, accepting the pity and prayers of the church elders. She had weaponized religion and morality to completely isolate me from my community. She had painted me as a barren, career-obsessed failure to justify the theft she had already committed. She was sitting in the house of God counting the $20,000 she had stolen from the daughter she helped raise. The sheer scale of their depravity was staggering. They had weaponized every single vulnerability they could find. They used Terrence's cowardice and lust. They used my dedication to my career. They used the sanctity of our church. They manipulated every variable to execute a perfect financial shakedown. But they made the mistake of leaving a paper trail for a woman who reads bank statements like other people read books. I hit print on my keyboard. The laser printer in the corner of my office whirred to life, spitting out page after page of undeniable proof. I printed the satellite images of the abandoned strip mall. I printed the corporate registration documents for the fake clinic. I printed the wire transfer logs showing the money moving to the Bahamas. And finally, I printed the skip trace report proving Vivian accepted $20,000 of extorted funds into her personal credit union account. I gathered the warm papers and placed them neatly into a manila folder. I placed the crumpled receipt for the silicone theatrical belly right on top. This folder was no longer just an audit report. It was a loaded weapon. Terrence was out there right now, sweating, checking his phone, and wondering how he was going to survive the financial ruin he had brought upon himself. He thought he was paying for prenatal vitamins and specialized doctors. He had no idea he was funding a criminal enterprise run by his own mistress and mother-in-law. I needed to see him. I needed to look into his eyes and watch him squirm before I delivered the final blow. I grabbed my car keys and walked out of my house, ready to hunt my husband down. I knew exactly where Terrence parked his car. In the sprawling concrete parking garage beneath his Midtown Atlanta corporate office, he always chose the isolated spots on the fourth level, away from the main elevators to avoid door dings on his pristine luxury sedan. I navigated the spiraling ramps, the tires of my car squealing faintly against the polished concrete. I found his vehicle parked in the corner, exactly where I expected it to be. I pulled my car into the empty space directly across from his, turned off the engine, and waited. The heavy manila folder rested on the passenger seat beside me, loaded with the financial execution papers he had no idea existed. I did not have to wait long. 20 minutes later, the heavy metal fire door creaked open, and Terrence walked out into the dim fluorescent light of the parking garage. I watched him approach through my tinted windshield. The confident, booming man who had raised a glass to our marriage just 3 months ago was completely gone. In his place was a hollowed-out shell of a human being. Terrence had easily lost 15 pounds. His tailored suit, which normally fit his broad shoulders, perfectly hung loosely on his frame. The fabric pooled awkwardly around his waist. His shoulders were slumped. His gait was heavy and dragging. But what struck me most was his face. Deep dark circles carved hollow shadows under his eyes. His skin lacked its usual warmth, looking sallow and gray under the harsh garage lights. He held his phone in his right hand, staring down at the screen with an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. His thumb swiped frantically across the glass. I stepped out of my car and slammed the door shut. The loud metallic thud echoed sharply through the empty concrete structure. Terrence physically jumped. His head snapped up, and the expensive leather briefcase slipped from his shoulder, hitting the ground with a heavy smack. He stared at me like he had just seen a ghost materialize in the shadows. He quickly shoved his phone into his jacket pocket, but not before I saw the screen light up with another incoming text message. He was jumping at shadows, terrified of his own shadow, and clearly operating under immense psychological pressure. "Kendra," he stammered, taking a cautious step backward. "What are you doing here? You should not be here. We agreed to let the lawyers handle all communication." I walked slowly across the driving lane, closing the physical distance between us, until I was standing barely 3 feet away from him. He smelled of stale coffee and nervous sweat. He could not bring himself to look me in the eye. His gaze darted to the concrete floor, to my car, to the exit ramp, anywhere but my face. "We did not agree to anything, Terrence," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and flat. "You sent a cowardly text message in the middle of the night after stealing $150,000 from our joint savings account. That is not an agreement. That is a financial crime." Terrence flinched. He brought a hand up to rub the back of his neck, a nervous tic he only displayed when he was backed into a corner. "I did not steal it, Kendra," he muttered, his voice tight and defensive. "I told you I had to secure the funds. You do not understand what is happening right now. Jasmine's pregnancy is high risk. The complications are severe. The out-of-pocket medical expenses are mounting faster than I can track. I had to pay the clinic. I have a responsibility to keep her and the baby safe." I stood there listening to the utter desperation in his voice. I studied the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his mouth. My auditor brain dissected his physical and verbal cues with brutal efficiency. He was not lying to me. He genuinely believed every single word coming out of his mouth. He genuinely believed his one-night stand had resulted in a fragile, high-risk pregnancy. He believed he was funding a legitimate medical clinic. He believed the baby was in danger. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Terrence was not the mastermind of this operation. Terrence was the mark. He was the victim of a highly sophisticated extortion ring run by his own mistress and my stepmother. Jasmine and Vivian had identified his biggest weakness, his overwhelming guilt, and his desperate need to protect his public image, and they were weaponizing it to bleed him absolutely dry. They were shaking him down for every dollar he had, creating fake medical emergencies and imaginary clinic bills to keep him in a state of constant financial panic. "And you think $150,000 covers these specialized medical bills?" I asked, crossing my arms. "It barely scratches the surface," Terrence blurted out, running a hand over his face in sheer exhaustion. His phone buzzed violently in his jacket pocket. He flinched again, his hand twitching toward the fabric before he forced it back down to his side. "The treatments are experimental, Kendra. The specialists demand upfront payments. And Vivian is breathing down my neck, demanding I set up a secure housing trust for Jasmine before the baby arrives. They are threatening to take this public, to drag my name through the mud if I do not provide the proper financial security." He finally looked up at me. His eyes were bloodshot and pleading. He looked like a drowning man reaching for a life raft, completely unaware that he was asking the very woman he threw overboard to save him. "That is actually why I need to talk to you, Kendra," he said, taking a hesitant step closer. "I need you to be reasonable about the divorce settlement. The lawyers are taking too long, and I am running out of liquid cash. I need you to sign over your premarital properties to me. Just sign the quitclaim deeds, so I can leverage the equity. I can liquidate the assets to cover Jasmine's mounting medical bills and secure the housing trust Vivian is demanding. If you just sign the properties over, I promise I will not touch your retirement accounts. We can make this clean and fast." I stared at him in absolute astonishment. The sheer audacity of his request was staggering. He was being extorted by 2 ruthless con artists, and his solution was to demand that his betrayed wife hand over her $1.2 million real estate portfolio to pay his ransom. He wanted me to sacrifice the assets I built with my own hands to fund a silicone prop belly and Vivian's offshore bank accounts. He actually thought he could appeal to my sense of logic. He thought because I was an auditor, I would see the mathematical benefit of sacrificing my properties to protect my retirement. He was so deeply entrenched in the scam, so blinded by the fear of Vivian destroying his reputation, that he had completely lost his grip on reality. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a prolonged, aggressive vibration. A phone call. He pulled it out of his pocket, his hands visibly shaking. I caught a glimpse of the caller identification before he hastily muted the screen. It was Jasmine. She was calling him in the middle of the workday, hunting for her next payout, tightening the leash. "You look terrible, Terrence," I said, breaking the silence. My voice held absolutely no warmth, no pity, no anger. It was the clinical observation of a mortician declaring a time of death. "You look like a man who is being eaten alive from the inside out." "Kendra, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Just tell me you will sign the papers. Tell me you will sign the deed so I can stop the bleeding. They are pushing me to the edge. I just need to make sure the baby survives. I need to do the right thing. Just give me an answer." I looked at the pathetic, desperate man standing in the dim parking garage. He was drowning in a sea of lies, and he wanted me to throw him my life jacket so he could hand it to the sharks circling him. I thought about the manila folder sitting on the passenger seat of my car. I thought about the shipping receipt for the theatrical belly and the routing numbers for the offshore accounts. I could have ended his nightmare right then and there. I could have opened the folder, handed him the proof, and watched the extortion ring crumble to dust on the concrete floor. But I was not going to save him. Terrence had made his bed when he destroyed my marriage and humiliated me in front of my family. Now he was going to lie in it while the monsters he invited into his life picked his bones clean. I did not give him an answer. I did not scream or yell or curse his name. I simply turned around, walked back to my car, and opened the door. Kendra Terrence shouted, his voice echoing frantically off the concrete pillars. "Where are you going? You have to give me an answer. What are you going to do about the properties?" "Kendra." I slid into the driver's seat and shut the heavy door, cutting off his desperate pleas. I started the engine, the roar of the motor drowning out the sound of his voice. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking space, leaving him standing alone in the shadows, clutching a buzzing phone he was too terrified to answer. Let him sweat. Let him panic. Let him drain every last line of credit he had left. The financial audit was complete. I had the motive, I had the money trail, and I had the proof of the scam. Now I just needed the final nail in the coffin to completely destroy Vivian and Jasmine without leaving a single shred of plausible deniability. I pulled out of the parking garage and merged into the heavy Atlanta traffic, heading straight for the one place Vivian thought was completely impenetrable: my childhood home. I navigated the winding, tree-lined streets of the Cascade area, pulling my car into a shaded cul-de-sac a block away from the 2-story brick colonial where I grew up. Vivian was not home. My stepmother was currently 300 miles away, attending the annual Women of Faith Restorative Retreat in Savannah. It was a highly publicized church event, a 3-day luxury spa weekend masquerading as spiritual warfare. She had posted about it on social media all week, soliciting prayers for her safe travels and showing off her matching luggage sets. I knew her schedule down to the exact hour. That gave me a pristine window of opportunity to execute my extraction. I parked my car under the thick canopy of a weeping oak, keeping my vehicle completely out of direct sight from the neighbors. I walked down the familiar concrete sidewalk, the afternoon heat pressing heavily against the pavement. I reached into my purse and pulled out a heavy brass key. It was the original physical key my father had placed in my hand on my 18th birthday, long before his heart gave out, and Vivian took absolute control of his estate. She had changed the electronic security codes on the front gate and the garage, but she never bothered to change the physical deadbolt on the side utility door. She always considered herself too untouchable to be robbed. The brass key slid into the lock with a satisfying metallic click. I pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped into the mudroom. The central air conditioning hit me instantly, carrying the familiar suffocating scent of vanilla plug-ins and lemon polish. It was the exact smell of my childhood, but there was no nostalgia waiting for me here. The house was dead quiet. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy and eerie, the kind of absolute stillness that makes your own heartbeat sound like a drum thudding rapidly in your ears. I stood completely still in the entryway for a full 60 seconds, listening for any sign of a housekeeper, a contractor, or a stray guest. There was nothing. Just the faint hum of the massive stainless steel refrigerator in the gourmet kitchen. I moved out of the mudroom and into the main hallway, my rubber-soled shoes making absolutely no noise against the polished hardwood floors. I knew this house like the back of my hand. I knew which floorboards creaked outside the downstairs guest bathroom. I knew how to avoid the motion sensor radius in the formal dining room by hugging the left wall tightly. I navigated the sprawling space not as a daughter returning to her family home, but as a ghost infiltrating a hostile corporate stronghold. My target was on the second floor at the very end of the east wing. My late father's study. After he passed away, Vivian had immediately commandeered the space, ripping out his dark leather furniture and replacing it with cream-colored sofas and sleek glass tables. She turned his sanctuary into her personal command center, where she managed her church committees and plotted her ruthless social climbs. But she could not rip out the architecture. She could not remove the heavy steel fireproof safe box bolted directly into the concrete foundation beneath the floorboards in the master closet. That safe held my original property deeds. When I bought my first 3 real estate investments, I kept the physical notarized deeds in my father's safe for absolute security. I never moved them to my own house because I never imagined I would need to hide them from my own husband. Terrence's divorce lawyers would be filing a motion of discovery soon. They would demand all physical and digital records of my assets to place a temporary injunction preventing me from selling or moving my properties during the divorce proceedings. If Vivian handed Terrence my original deeds, he could leverage them to stall the legal process and bleed me dry in court fees while he funded Jasmine's fake medical bills. I needed to remove the ammunition before they even realized the war had officially started. I crept up the grand staircase, trailing my hand lightly along the mahogany banister. The sunlight streaming through the sheer curtains illuminated the dust motes dancing in the silent air. I passed by Jasmine's old bedroom, the door shut tight, and kept moving until I reached the heavy double doors of the study. I turned the brass knob and stepped inside. The room was immaculate. Stacks of church bulletins and social event invitations were arranged in perfect symmetrical piles on Vivian's glass desk. I ignored all of it. I went straight for the walk-in closet at the back of the room. I knelt down on the plush cream carpet, pushed aside a row of expensive designer shoeboxes, and located the false floorboard in the back right corner. I pressed my fingers against the hidden magnetic latch and lifted the wood panel. The cold gray steel of my father's safe stared back at me. I punched in the 6-digit numerical code. It was my father's date of birth. Vivian had never bothered to reset it because she assumed no one else knew the master combination. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open smoothly. I reached inside and pulled out the thick waterproof envelope containing my 3 property deeds. I checked the wax seals and the notarized stamps. Everything was exactly as I had left it. I slid the heavy envelope into my leather tote bag, zipping it shut. The primary objective was complete. I had secured my assets. I could have closed the safe, put the floorboard back, and walked out of that house without leaving a single trace of my presence. I had exactly what I came for. But as I stood up and brushed the carpet fibers from my knees, my eyes drifted back to Vivian's immaculate glass desk sitting in the center of the room. A strange pulling sensation gripped my chest. The financial auditor inside me was not entirely satisfied. I had the money trail. I had the shipping receipt for the silicone belly. I had the offshore routing numbers, but I still did not have the complete psychological blueprint of the scam. I needed to know exactly how deep Vivian's claws were buried in my husband's mind and how they had orchestrated the initial trap. I walked slowly over to the desk, my eyes scanning the locked drawers and the pristine surface. The heavy mahogany desk sat in the center of the room like a dark altar. Vivian had covered the polished wood with a custom-cut piece of tempered glass, to protect the surface, but the structure underneath was solid antique timber. I ran my hands along the thick beveled edges, feeling the weight of the furniture. Vivian was a creature of absolute habit and rigid control. She did not trust digital cloud servers or encrypted digital drives with her true secrets. She was an old-school manipulator. She believed that anything stored on a computer could be hacked, but something buried in physical form under lock and key was untouchable. She liked to hold her power in her hands. I walked around to the heavy leather executive chair and examined the layout of the desk. There were 3 drawers on the left and 1 large, deep filing drawer on the bottom right. I gripped the brass handle of the bottom right drawer and pulled. It was locked tight, refusing to budge even a fraction of an inch. I did not panic. I opened the unlocked top center drawer and rummaged through her pristine collection of monogrammed stationery and expensive fountain pens until my fingers closed around a heavy, solid brass letter opener. It was shaped like a dagger, sharp and unyielding. I knelt on the plush cream carpet, positioning myself directly in front of the locked bottom drawer. I wedged the sharp, flat edge of the brass letter opener right into the tight seam above the locking mechanism. I wrapped both hands around the handle, gripping it tightly, and drove my weight downward using the thick mahogany frame for leverage. The metal groaned against the wood. I pushed harder, ignoring the dull ache in my palms. With a loud, sharp crack, the internal locking pin snapped in half. The heavy drawer slid open smoothly, rolling out on its metal tracks. The drawer was packed tight with hanging manila file folders meticulously labeled with church committee budgets and country club event planning receipts. It looked like the perfectly mundane filing system of a dedicated society woman. But my eyes were not focused on the folders. My eyes were focused on the spatial dimensions of the drawer itself. An auditor is trained to look for negative space. We are trained to notice the gaps between what is presented and what actually exists. I looked at the exterior frame of the massive mahogany desk. The depth from the front panel to the solid backboard was easily 30 inches. But as I pulled the drawer out to its maximum extension and looked inside the hanging files, hit a solid wooden barrier after only 24 inches. There was a 6-inch discrepancy, a 6-inch void of dead space hiding at the very back of the drawer. I quickly pulled every single manila folder out of the drawer, tossing them carelessly onto the pristine carpet. When the drawer was completely empty, I tapped my knuckles against the back wooden panel. The sound did not land with a solid, heavy thud. It echoed back with a hollow, empty resonance. It was a false bottom panel installed vertically to shorten the depth of the drawer. I gripped the brass letter opener again. I jammed the sharp tip into the microscopic seam where the vertical panel met the floor of the drawer. I twisted my wrist violently, applying maximum torque. The wood splintered with a sharp crunching sound. The concealed magnetic latch gave way, and the false wooden panel popped forward, falling flat into the drawer. I reached my hand into the dark 6-inch cavity hidden at the very back of the desk. My fingers brushed against cold, smooth leather. I grasped the objects and pulled them out into the sunlight streaming through the study windows. I was holding 3 small black leather-bound banking ledgers. I sat cross-legged on the floor, resting the first ledger on my lap. I flipped open the thick cover. The pages inside were filled with Vivian's aggressive, slanted cursive handwriting. My heart hammered a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs as my eyes scanned the columns of numbers. It was a masterpiece of illicit accounting. Right there in black ink were the exact 9-digit tax routing numbers I had tracked on my laptop just hours ago. She had written down the corporate registration details for Specialized Medical Services, LLC, the fake clinic registered to the abandoned strip mall. She had documented the exact correspondent banking hub in New York. She had listed the private offshore trust account in the Bahamas down to the final digit. I opened the second ledger, and the true scope of her predatory financial warfare was laid bare. This book did not just track the stolen funds, it tracked my husband. Vivian had meticulously compiled a comprehensive profile of Terrence's entire financial existence. She had listed his estimated annual salary, his bonus structures, and his liquid cash reserves. But it went much darker than that. She had tracked every single high-yield credit card he had recently opened. She knew his credit limits. She knew his daily withdrawal maximums. She had calculated a precise mathematical formula detailing exactly how much capital they could extract from him before he completely defaulted and was forced into bankruptcy. I flipped to the final page of the second ledger. There it was. The disbursement schedule for the stolen $150,000. $10,000 was allocated for fake medical imaging, likely forged ultrasounds purchased through dark web vendors. $4,500 was explicitly marked for the silicone theatrical prop. And taking up the entire bottom half of the page was the final distribution of the extorted wealth. $115,000 routed to Jasmine's offshore account, and a neat $20,000 cut funneled directly into Vivian's personal credit union account right here in Atlanta. It was a fully operational itemized budget designed exclusively to execute the destruction of my marriage and the theft of my life savings. I set the ledgers down on the carpet, my mind racing with the lethal perfection of her accounting. But the financial data was only half of the crime. I had the money trail, and I had the physical evidence of the prop. What I still lacked was the psychological blueprint. How did they get Terrence into that hotel room? How did they trap a man who for 5 years had never shown a single sign of infidelity? I leaned forward and reached my arm back into the dark, dusty cavity of the false drawer. My fingers scraped against the very back wall and touched heavy, thick parchment paper. I grabbed the object and pulled it out. It was a large cream-colored envelope completely unsealed. Written across the front in Vivian's heavy black ink was a single word: Jasmine. I stared at my stepsister's name. This was not a birthday card. This was not a casual note between a mother and a daughter. The envelope was thick, heavy with the weight of multiple pages folded inside. My hands, which had been perfectly steady while picking the lock and analyzing the ledgers, suddenly felt remarkably cold. I slid my fingers inside the unsealed flap and pulled out the contents. It consisted of 4 large pages of Vivian's personal custom embossed stationery. The thick paper rustled loudly in the suffocating silence of the study. I unfolded the pages, smoothing them out flat across my lap. I looked down at the very first sentence written at the top of the page. The breath instantly stopped in my throat. My blood ran completely cold, freezing solid in my veins. This was not just a letter, it was an instruction manual. It was a step-by-step chronological playbook drafted months ago, detailing exactly how to lay the trap, pull the trigger, and execute the psychological destruction of my husband. I read the first line of the letter, and the air in the room grew ice cold. Vivian had written everything in her elegant, looping handwriting. It read like a corporate business plan designed for absolute ruin. She outlined the entire plot with terrifying precision. The letter was dated right before Terrence took his corporate retreat to Miami. Vivian gave Jasmine specific instructions. She told her to book a flight to Miami and track Terrence to his hotel lobby bar. She told her to wait until his colleagues went up to their rooms and then slide into the empty seat next to him. The objective was simple: order him drinks, keep ordering until the bartender cuts him off, get him completely blackout drunk. Vivian explicitly wrote that it did not matter if he was conscious or capable of doing anything at all. Jasmine just needed to drag his dead weight into his hotel room, take off his clothes, and get under the sheets. When he woke up the next morning with a pounding headache and zero memory of the night before, Jasmine was instructed to put on the performance of a lifetime. She had to cry, she had to act ashamed, she had to convince a deeply hungover and confused man that they had crossed a line he could never uncross. The cruelty on the page was breathtaking. Vivian knew my husband was a man obsessed with doing the right thing. She knew his pride and his deeply ingrained sense of duty would prevent him from questioning the narrative. He would assume the guilt without demanding proof. The second page of the letter detailed the pregnancy timeline. Vivian instructed Jasmine to wait exactly 6 weeks before delivering the killing blow. She told her to buy a fake positive test online and corner Terrence when he was most vulnerable. The instructions were cold and calculated. Vivian wrote that Terrence would panic, and his panic was their primary source of revenue. They were going to use his guilt to force him to drain his accounts immediately, but the cash was only phase 1. The ultimate target was always my real estate. I held the thick parchment paper up to the sunlight streaming through the window. I read the exact words Vivian had written to her daughter. The ink was dark and heavy, pressing deeply into the page. Kendra always thought she was better than us because of her career. Once we get Terrence's money and her properties, Terrence can find out there was a miscarriage. By then, we will be set. I read those sentences 3 times over. I let the sheer malicious weight of her words sink into my bones. She wanted to punish me for being successful. She resented my career and the wealth I had built with my own hands. She was willing to completely obliterate my marriage, bankrupt my husband, and strip me of my assets just to put me in my place. And she was going to use a fake dead baby as the ultimate exit strategy. A normal person might have grabbed their phone and dialed emergency services right then and there. A normal person would have called the police, reported the extortion, and handed the evidence over to a detective. But I did not reach for my phone to call the authorities. I reached for my phone to open the camera application. I turned the flash off and held my phone steady above the desk. I took high-resolution photographs of every single page of the letter. I photographed the banking ledgers. I photographed the false bottom drawer and the splintered wood where I had broken the lock. I was building an impenetrable chain of evidence. Once the digital copies were secured and uploaded to my encrypted cloud drive, I carefully folded the original handwritten letter and placed it into my leather tote bag alongside my property deeds. I took the 3 banking ledgers and stacked them neatly inside the bag. I did not try to fix the broken drawer. I did not try to hide the fact that someone had breached the safe. I left the empty manila folders scattered across the plush cream carpet. I wanted Vivian to come home from her Women of Faith retreat and walk into her study. I wanted her to see the shattered wood and the empty cavity at the back of her desk. I wanted her to feel the exact moment the ground opened up and swallowed her whole. She would know instantly that I had the blueprints to her destruction, but she would have absolutely no idea when or how I was going to use them. I walked out of my childhood home, locked the heavy brass door behind me, and walked back to my car. I did not drive home. I drove straight to the downtown law office of my attorney, Elias. I walked past the receptionist without an appointment and opened the door to Elias's private office. He was sitting at his desk reviewing case files. I dropped my heavy leather tote bag onto his desk. The loud thud made him look up in surprise. I pulled up a chair, sat down, and began pulling the documents out one by one. I laid out the financial forensic reports showing the $150,000 wire transfer. I laid out the satellite images of the abandoned strip mall, registered as the high-risk medical clinic. I placed the shipping receipt for the medical-grade silicone theatrical belly right in the center of the desk. And finally, I handed him the original handwritten letter drafted by my stepmother. Elias is a veteran divorce attorney. He has seen spouses hide money offshore. He has seen bitter custody battles and corporate espionage. But as he read Vivian's letter, the color completely drained from his face. He put the letter down, took off his glasses, and looked at me with absolute disbelief. He reached for his desk phone. "We need to call the district attorney right now," Elias said, his voice tight with shock. "This is felony extortion and wire fraud. They are running a criminal enterprise. We can have them arrested by tonight." I reached out and placed my hand over his phone, pressing the receiver down. "No," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "If we call the police, they get arrested in their homes. They get a quiet arraignment and they hide behind bail money. That is too easy. They humiliated me in front of my entire church congregation. They tried to steal my life savings and my real estate. They sat at my anniversary dinner and made a mockery of my marriage. I am not letting them go quietly into a police car." Elias looked at me, his hand still resting on the phone. "What do you want to do, Kendra?" "I want to schedule the final divorce settlement meeting," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I want Terrence, Vivian, and Jasmine all sitting at the same table. I want them to think they have won. I want them to bring the paperwork demanding my properties. We are going to let them walk willingly to the executioner's block. And then we are going to drop the blade." Elias slowly pulled his hand away from the phone. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. He gathered the documents, the receipt, the ledgers, and the letter, and placed them carefully into a thick manila folder. The trap was officially set. All we had to do now was wait for the rats to walk in for the cheese. The crisp $1 bill sat perfectly still on the polished mahogany table directly in front of my folded hands. George Washington stared up at me, bathed in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the conference room. Jasmine sat back in her plush leather chair, looking incredibly pleased with herself. She rested her hands on the curve of her burgundy maternity dress, adopting the serene posture of a woman who believed she had just delivered the ultimate killing blow. Vivian sat in the corner, her arms crossed, her chin raised in a portrait of absolute victory. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the tears, the screaming, the desperate begging of a discarded wife. I did not give them a single drop of emotion. I kept my face as blank and unreadable as a blank spreadsheet. I slowly shifted my gaze from the dollar bill to Terrence. He was still avoiding my eyes, staring miserably at his legal pad, muttering his cowardly excuses about bloodlines and responsibilities. He was practically begging me to sign the divorce settlement and hand over my $1.2 million real estate portfolio so he could satisfy the extortionist sitting right next to him. I leaned back in my chair and gave Elias a single deliberate nod. Elias did not say a word. The seasoned attorney simply reached out and rested his large hand on the thick manila folder sitting off to the side of his notepad. He unfastened the metal clasp. The sharp popping sound echoed loudly in the suffocating silence of the room. Jasmine immediately leaned forward, her acrylic nails tapping eagerly against the armrest. Her eyes gleamed with raw greed. She assumed Elias was pulling out the finalized property deeds, transferring my hard-earned investments directly into Terrence's control. Vivian uncrossed her arms and sat up straight on the edge of her seat, ready to witness the formal surrender of my wealth. Elias bypassed both of them completely. He placed his hand flat on top of the heavy folder and slid it directly down the center of the table. The thick paper glided smoothly across the polished wood, bypassing my space, bypassing Jasmine, and coming to a dead stop right in front of Terrence's chest. Terrence frowned. He looked at Elias with dull confusion. "What is this?" he asked, his voice tight and raspy. I did not answer him. Elias did not answer him. The silence demanded that he open it himself. Terrence reached out with hesitant, trembling fingers and flipped open the heavy cover of the folder. I watched him with the clinical detachment of a scientist, observing a lab rat running straight into a high-voltage trap. The very first page resting on top of the stack was the high-resolution satellite image of the abandoned strip mall. Printed right next to the photograph was the corporate registration document for Specialized Medical Services, LLC. I watched Terrence's eyes scan the page. He read the address out loud under his breath, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He looked at the photograph of the crumbling asphalt, the boarded-up storefront, and the chain-link security fence. He recognized the name of the company immediately because it was the exact name he had wired $150,000 to in the dead of night. But he could not reconcile the image of a derelict discount cellular store with the high-risk maternal health clinic he thought he was funding. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for an explanation. He still thought this was some sort of real estate document, a property I was offering in lieu of the others. "Turn the page, Terrence," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly in his throat. He pinched the corner of the paper and turned to the second document. It was the official financial trace report generated by my auditing software. I had used a bright red marker to highlight the specific routing pathways. I watched his eyes track the thick red line detailing the movement of his stolen life savings. He saw the $130,000 routed through the New York clearinghouse and funneled directly into a private offshore trust account in the Bahamas registered under Jasmine's name. His breathing hitched. The sound was sharp and sudden in the quiet room. But the real devastation hit when his eyes dropped to the second highlighted line on the page. He stared at the remaining $20,000. He tracked the routing number to the regional credit union right here in Atlanta. He read the primary account holder's name printed clearly in black ink, Vivian. Terrence physically jolted in his chair. The blood began to rapidly drain from his face, leaving behind a sickly grayish pallor. His mouth opened slightly, drawing in a shallow, ragged breath. He turned his head slowly, his neck stiff and mechanical, and looked directly at Vivian sitting in the corner. Vivian had no idea what he was looking at. She shifted uncomfortably under his sudden intense scrutiny, craning her neck, trying to see the papers from across the room. Terrence looked back down at the spreadsheet. The gears in his mind were violently grinding against each other, attempting to process a betrayal so massive it defied his comprehension. He was realizing that his own mother-in-law, the woman who had publicly prayed for him at church and loudly demanded he take responsibility for his actions, had charged him a $20,000 commission fee to facilitate the destruction of his marriage. But the absolute crushing blow was still waiting on the next page. "Turn it!" I commanded the authority in my voice, leaving absolutely no room for hesitation. Terrence's hands were shaking so violently now that the paper rattled as he lifted it. He turned to the third document. It was the crumpled, flattened shipping receipt that Chloe had pulled from the trunk of Malik's car. The logo for the Los Angeles Theatrical Effects Studio was printed boldly across the top header. Terrence stared at the billing information. He saw Vivian's name listed as the purchaser. He saw his own brother's address listed as the shipping destination. And then his eyes hit the itemized description line. I watched the exact millisecond his entire psychological foundation collapsed. It was a terrifying, fascinating thing to witness in real time. He read the words printed on the receipt. One high-end medical grade, silicone theatrical belly. 6-month gestation. Custom caramel skin tone blending. Adhesive backing included. He read the line again, and then he read it a third time. The heavy, oppressive silence in the conference room was suddenly shattered by the sound of Terrence gasping for air. It sounded like he was suffocating. His pupils dilated massively, swallowing the irises of his eyes. Heavy drops of cold sweat erupted across his forehead and upper lip. He began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving irregularly beneath his tailored suit jacket. He slowly turned his head away from the documents and looked at Jasmine. He did not look at her face. He looked directly down at her stomach. He stared at the curve of the burgundy maternity dress pressing tightly against the edge of the mahogany table. He stared at it, not with the loving devotion of an expectant father looking at a miracle of life, but with the absolute visceral horror of a man staring at a monster. He realized he was looking at a $4,500 piece of molded rubber strapped to a sociopath with professional-grade adhesive. There was no baby. There was no high-risk pregnancy. There was no fragile medical emergency requiring hundreds of thousands of dollars in experimental treatments. There was no legacy. There was no bloodline to protect. The truth crashed down on his shoulders with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. He had blown up a flawless 5-year marriage to a woman who had been nothing but deeply loyal to him. He had willingly walked away from our beautiful home. He had stolen our entire life savings. He had secretly opened high-yield credit cards and taken out predatory loans, bankrupting his own financial future. He had disgraced himself in front of his entire family, his brother, his colleagues, and our church congregation. He had willingly subjected himself to endless public humiliation and massive unpayable debt. And he had done all of it for absolutely nothing. He had traded his entire existence for a prop from a movie set. Jasmine noticed his sudden, terrifying change in demeanor. The smug, victorious smile finally slid off her face, replaced by a flicker of genuine alarm. "Terrence, baby, what is wrong?" she asked, reaching a manicured hand out to touch his arm. "What do those papers say?" Terrence violently recoiled from her touch as if she had just pressed a branding iron against his skin. He shoved his chair backwards so hard the heavy wooden legs shrieked against the hardwood floor. He stood up, towering over the table, the manila folder clutched in his trembling fists. His breathing was loud, ragged, and completely out of control. He looked like a man who had just woken up from a coma to find himself standing in the middle of a burning building. The facade of the dutiful, conflicted husband completely evaporated. The reality of his absolute ruin took its place. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded calmly on the table, watching the fire catch. Terrence let out a sound that I can only describe as the roar of a dying animal. It was a guttural, agonizing scream that ripped straight from the bottom of his lungs. He did not just stand up. He launched his entire body weight across the heavy mahogany table. His knees slammed into the polished wood, sending legal pads and pens scattering across the floor. He lunged directly at Jasmine, his hands outstretched, grasping wildly at the collar of her burgundy maternity dress. Jasmine shrieked a high-pitched grating sound, completely devoid of the sweet, soft-spoken mother-to-be persona she had been performing for the last 3 months. She scrambled backward, her office chair tipping precariously on its wheels. Her hands instinctively flew down, not to protect a growing child, but to physically shield the edges of her $4,500 silicone prop. She crossed her arms tightly over her midsection, twisting her torso away from Terrence's grasping hands. "Tell me it is a lie!" Terrence screamed, his voice cracking, his face contorted in absolute rage and devastation. "Tell me what is under that dress, Jasmine. Take it off. Take it off right now." He grabbed the fabric of her dress, pulling her forward. During the violent scuffle, the unthinkable happened. Jasmine's perfectly rounded belly shifted. It did not just jiggle. It moved entirely independent of her anatomy, sliding 2 inches to the left under the tight spandex fabric. The adhesive backing had buckled under the physical struggle. The impossible anatomical distortion was right there for everyone in the room to witness. "Get off me, you crazy lunatic!" Jasmine shrieked, batting at his hands, her manicured acrylic nails scratching at his wrists. "Mom, do something. Call the police. He is attacking me." Vivian finally broke out of her stunned paralysis. The polished, composed matriarch of our Atlanta church shattered into pieces. She lunged forward, grabbing Terrence by the shoulders of his tailored suit, trying to yank him backward. "Get your hands off my daughter, you pathetic excuse for a man!" Vivian yelled. Her face flushed a deep, angry purple. "I will have you arrested for assaulting a pregnant woman. I will ruin you, Terrence. I will make sure you rot in a jail cell." Terrence shoved Vivian backward with a violent sweep of his arm, sending her stumbling into the wall. "You are already ruining me," he roared, spit flying from his lips. "You stole my life savings. You set me up. There is no baby. That is enough." Elias's voice boomed through the conference room. It was not a shout. It was the heavy, authoritative command of a seasoned attorney taking absolute control of a volatile crime scene. The sheer force of his tone made Terrence freeze. Jasmine backed into the corner, hyperventilating, clutching her displaced silicone stomach. Vivian stood against the wall, breathing heavily, straightening her emerald green blazer, attempting to regain a shred of her dignified authority. "You are all acting like rabid dogs fighting over scraps," Elias said, calmly adjusting his suit jacket. "But the feast is already over, and you, Vivian, are the main course." Elias reached into his leather briefcase sitting on the floor beside his chair. He did not pull out a settlement offer. He did not pull out a property deed. He pulled out a single thick piece of cream-colored parchment paper, encased in a clear plastic evidence sleeve. He placed it gently on the center of the mahogany table, smoothing it flat with the palm of his hand. I watched Vivian's eyes dart toward the table. I watched the exact moment she recognized her own custom-embossed stationery. I watched her recognize her own heavy, slanted, cursive handwriting. The color drained completely from Vivian's face, leaving her looking like a hollowed-out corpse. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She took a slow, trembling step toward the table, her eyes locked onto the letter. "This is a certified copy," Elias explained, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "It is a highly detailed, handwritten business plan drafted by you, Vivian, outlining exactly how your daughter was going to get Terrence blackout drunk, fake a pregnancy, and extort him for $150,000. It also details your specific intent to use his guilt to bully my client Kendra into surrendering a $1.2 million real estate portfolio." Vivian lunged for the table, her manicured hands desperately clawed at the clear plastic sleeve, trying to snatch the document away. Elias did not even flinch. He simply placed 2 heavy fingers on the edge of the paper, pinning it to the wood. "I would not do that, Vivian," Elias said, his tone dangerously quiet. "Tearing up a copy will not save you. The original handwritten letter, along with the forensic financial audit tracking your offshore wire transfers and your personal credit union deposits, is no longer in my possession." Vivian froze her fingers, hovering inches from the paper. Her breathing grew shallow and rapid. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice trembling with raw, unfiltered terror. I handed the original documents directly to the district attorney of Fulton County at 8 o'clock this morning, Elias stated, delivering the ultimate death blow. You moved $150,000 through a domestic banking hub into an offshore account using false pretenses and digital communications. That is not just a family dispute, Vivian. That is felony extortion and wire fraud. It is a federal crime. The prosecutor is currently reviewing the file to draft the arrest warrants. You are looking at a minimum of 10 to 15 years in federal prison, both of you. Jasmine let out a loud, dramatic wail, sliding down the wall until she hit the floor. The silicone belly bunched awkwardly under her dress, completely ruining the illusion. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically. But these were not the fake, calculated tears she had cried at my anniversary dinner. These were the real, ugly, terrified tears of a woman who suddenly realized her entire life was over. Vivian backed away from the table, her hands shaking violently. She looked at me, her eyes wide and pleading desperately, searching for the obedient stepdaughter she had controlled for 2 decades. Kendra, please, Vivian gasped, her voice cracking. You cannot do this. We are family. I raised you. You have to stop them. Please call your lawyer off. We will give the money back. We will cancel the divorce settlement. Just tell them it was a misunderstanding. I sat perfectly still, absorbing her desperation. The woman who had spent years making me feel small, the woman who had publicly humiliated me in front of my church, the woman who had orchestrated the destruction of my marriage was now begging for my mercy. It was the most satisfying moment of my entire life. I slowly reached my hand out and picked up the crisp $1 bill Jasmine had slid across the table 20 minutes earlier. I folded it neatly in half, and then in half again, pressing the creases sharply between my fingers. I stood up from my chair, smoothing out the skirt of my tailored suit. I walked around the mahogany table, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor, until I was standing directly over Jasmine. She looked up at me, her makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. Her eyes were red and swollen. I dropped the folded dollar bill. It fluttered through the air, landing softly on her lap, right on top of her fake silicone stomach. Keep it, I told her, my voice resonating with absolute ice. You are going to need it for the commissary at the county jail. I hear the soap is very expensive. I did not wait for her response. I did not look at Vivian, who was now hyperventilating against the wall. I did not look at Terrence, who was sitting on the floor with his head buried in his hands, completely destroyed by the realization that he had thrown his entire life away for absolutely nothing. I simply turned my back on the wreckage. I walked toward the heavy oak door of the conference room. Elias gathered his briefcase and followed closely behind me. I opened the door, stepped out into the brightly lit hallway, and let the door swing shut behind us. Even through the thick wood, I could hear the muffled sounds of the chaos erupting inside. I could hear Terrence screaming at Vivian. I could hear Jasmine wailing. They were tearing each other apart, trapped in a cage of their own making. I walked down the hallway toward the elevators, my head held high, completely untouched by the flames burning behind me. I had walked into that law firm as a betrayed wife, but I was walking out as a woman utterly and completely free. The audit was finished, and the accounts were finally settled. The fallout was swifter and far more devastating than I could have ever calculated. Within 48 hours, the Fulton County District Attorney reviewed the meticulous financial forensic file Elias and I had handed over. They did not hesitate. The combination of interstate wire transfers, dummy shell companies, and the handwritten extortion blueprint elevated the entire operation from a domestic dispute to a federal level. Vivian and Jasmine were arrested on a crisp Tuesday morning. I heard the beautiful details later from a highly satisfied Chloe. Law enforcement showed up at my childhood home just as Vivian was frantically packing her designer suitcases, likely trying to access whatever liquid funds she had left to flee the state. They escorted my stepmother out of her pristine brick colonial in handcuffs, right in front of the affluent neighbors she had spent decades trying to impress. Jasmine was picked up an hour later at her apartment. They were officially booked and charged with felony extortion and wire fraud, directly linked to the electronic transfer of the $150,000 under false pretenses. The local news channels picked up the story by the evening broadcast. The headline featured the beloved church matriarch and her daughter running a highly orchestrated financial scam, utilizing a medical-grade silicone theatrical prop. The entire church congregation that had shot me icy stares and shunned me just days prior was now watching their spiritual leader get processed into the county jail in an orange jumpsuit. Their social currency evaporated instantly. As for Terrence, his destruction was absolute and entirely of his own making. The divorce proceedings were swift, brutal, and surgically precise. When we stood before the family court judge, the bench was presented with irrefutable evidence of his financial infidelity and the gross dissipation of our marital assets. Terrence stood there, a broken, hollowed-out shell of a man with no legal representation, because he had completely bankrupted himself paying for imaginary medical bills and maxing out high-yield credit cards. The judge took one look at the meticulous paper trail and handed down a devastating ruling. I retained 100% of my $1.2 million premarital real estate portfolio. I retained all of my retirement accounts and my personal savings. Terrence received absolutely nothing. The court ruled that the $150,000 he had stolen and funneled to his extortionists effectively nullified any claim he might have ever had to a spousal settlement. He walked out of the courtroom with nothing but the clothes on his back and a mountain of predatory high-interest debt he could never hope to repay. Homeless, penniless, and thoroughly disgraced, Terrence had nowhere to go. His corporate job quietly let him go after the scandal surrounding his financial recklessness and his deep connection to a highly publicized federal fraud case became a liability in our professional circles. Stripped of his income and his pride, he crawled in desperation to the only family he had left. He went to his brother Malik, begging for a place to stay. But Terrence forgot one crucial detail. He forgot that Malik was married to Chloe, the same Chloe who had handed me the smoking gun receipt for the fake pregnancy belly, the same Chloe who despised the ground Vivian and Jasmine walked on. When Terrence showed up on their porch with his belongings shoved into garbage bags, Chloe stood at her front door and laid down the absolute law. She strictly forbade Jasmine or Vivian from ever coming near their family again, ensuring that even if they somehow posted bail, they would find no refuge in her home. She allowed Terrence to stay for Malik's sake, but she completely stripped him of whatever dignity he had left. My former husband, the man who used to drink vintage champagne and host lavish anniversary dinners in our 5-bedroom estate, was relegated to sleeping on a lumpy mattress in their damp, unfinished basement. Chloe ensured he was treated exactly like the liability he had become. He was completely isolated from the community, cut off from his former friends, and forced to live every single day in that dark, cold basement with the crushing reality of what he had done. He had willingly traded a deeply loyal wife, a beautiful home, and a secure financial future for a piece of molded rubber and a lifetime of unshakable humiliation. I did not stop at this criminal level. While the federal prosecutors handled the felony wire fraud and extortion charges, I unleashed the full force of my legal team on the civil front. Criminal court would put them in a jail cell, but civil court was going to ensure they could never financially recover from what they tried to do to me. Elias filed a massive civil suit against Vivian and Jasmine to recover the $150,000. Vivian tried to fight back. She tried to hire aggressive defense attorneys using the last remnants of her dwindling church connections to secure loans. But the courts do not care about your Sunday school attendance when there is an ironclad paper trail of stolen money and a literal instruction manual detailing an extortion plot. We moved with absolute ruthlessness. We froze every single one of Vivian's remaining assets. We froze her primary checking accounts, her offshore emergency funds, and her retirement portfolios. We placed a heavy legal lien on her beautiful brick colonial house, the very house where she had plotted my destruction. I extracted every single cent that had been wired out of my joint savings account. I recovered the money completely, returning the funds precisely back to where they belonged, under my sole exclusive control. Vivian was left with absolutely nothing but the impending reality of a federal prison sentence and a pile of legal fees she could never hope to pay. 6 months later, my life looked entirely different. The dust had completely settled, and the air was finally clear. I stepped out onto the wide wrap-around balcony of my primary property, the very same sprawling 5-bedroom estate Terrence had so foolishly abandoned. The warm Atlanta evening air wrapped around me like a comforting embrace. I held a delicate crystal glass of incredibly expensive red wine in my hand, taking a slow, deep sip. The flavor was rich, complex, and deeply satisfying. I leaned against the sturdy iron railing, looked out over my perfectly manicured lawn, and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. The house behind me was completely quiet, but it was no longer the heavy, terrifying silence of abandonment that had choked me on the night of my anniversary dinner. It was the serene, pristine silence of a personal sanctuary. The space felt clean, bright, and completely purged of toxic parasites. There were no more lies hiding in the shadows. There was no more manipulation masquerading as maternal love. There was no husband smiling at me while secretly funneling my money to his mistress. There was only me and the beautiful, secure reality I had built with my own 2 hands. My career completely skyrocketed, free from the constant mental weight of a cheating husband and the subtle, draining manipulation of a jealous stepmother. My professional focus became absolutely razor sharp. I closed 3 massive corporate audits back to back, earning the utmost respect of my firm. I secured a highly coveted promotion to senior partner. I even expanded my real estate portfolio, acquiring 2 new, lucrative commercial properties in the city. I was thriving. I was untouchable. I was completely in control of my own destiny. I had walked straight through the massive fire they deliberately set for me, and I did not just survive it. I used their flames to forge a life that was absolutely impenetrable. They thought they had found the perfect victim. They thought they could use the sanctity of marriage, the pressure of church society, and the heavy obligations of family to trap me in a corner. They tried to use my empathy against me, but they forgot I read numbers, not lies. Family does not extort you, and blood does not give anyone a free pass to destroy your life. Have you ever had to legally cut off a toxic family member? Tell me your story in the comments. Do not forget to like and subscribe, and remember, never apologize for taking out the trash. The story teaches us that true strength lies in keeping your composure when everything around you violently collapses. Betrayal from those closest to you, family or a spouse, can be paralyzing, but reacting with pure emotion only gives them more power. Instead, you must rely on hard facts, patience, and logic to dismantle their deceit. Blood does not ever excuse toxic behavior, and you owe no loyalty to those who plot your downfall. By setting ironclad boundaries and removing parasites from your life, you reclaim your power. The ultimate revenge is not vengeance itself, but achieving absolute freedom and thriving. If this story inspired you to stand your ground, hit that like button, subscribe, and share your own experiences with toxic relationships in the comments below.